Good morning, friends. I'm here to read chapter 36. Jack gave May what he hoped was enough time to get out of the way below, then took a deep breath and jumped into the hole after her. Beneath the grate was a stone vent or chimney, barely large enough for Jack to fall through. His bag wasn't so lucky, banging back and forth against the sides as he dropped. He only fell for a second or two before his feet slammed into another grate at the center of the fireplace, exactly like the one he just left. His landing sent pain spiking up through his boots, all the way to his knees, while his bag stopped its fall right on his head. Making things worse, he landed in a pile of soot, the remains of what had probably been an even deeper pile that May had landed in. Now soot completely blocked his view of the room he just dropped into, thrown into the air by the force of their landing. Though Jack couldn't make out what was happening, he could hear Philip screaming, "Stop, please!" The prince was yelling, but he wasn't the only one. A woman was also shrieking, the same woman who'd been speaking just a minute before. Malevolent. Whatever was happening, Jack wasn't helping anything, just standing there, waiting for feeling to re-enter the soles of his feet. So he hurled himself through the cloud of soot, only to jerk to a halt barely a foot out to avoid plowing into May, who'd stopped just beyond the fireplace. Jack frantically windmilled his arms and managed to avoid knocking them both down, though he had to grab May's shoulders to keep from falling over. The princess didn't even notice. She was so surprised by something. Jack quickly stood up straight and looked around to see what she was looking at, only to have his mouth drop open, unfortunately letting in more soot. They were too late to save Philip. The Wolf King had beaten them to it. The howling Jack had heard was the wolf, and now the animal in his human form was holding an unnaturally tall woman in the air by her neck. The woman, dressed in all black, had to be Malevolent. She had pupilless green eyes just like Merryweather's white ones. Unconscious goblin guards covered the room's floor in heaps, a byproduct of the wolf's entrance most likely. Right behind one of the larger goblin piles was Philip. Jack quickly ran to the prince, who was chained to the wall opposite the fireplace. Philip, his face battered and covered with bruises, hadn't stopped shouting since Jack jumped in. Except the prince wasn't screaming in pain anymore. He was pleading with the wolf, begging the animal not to kill Malevolent. "Please stop, Wolf King," Philip shouted, his voice breaking. "We need her. She must save Merryweather." The wolf, though, completely ignored the prince as he slowly choked the life out of the fairy queen. Malevolent, now quiet, just stared down at the wolf, her eyes on fire with hate. Jack swore loudly, then leapt forward and grabbed the wolf's arm, pulling with all his might. "Let go!" Jack yelled. The wolf barely gave him a glance. "Leave me be," he growled, then turned back to the woman in his grasp. "Jack!" May shouted from the other side of the wolf. "This might be a problem." "No kidding," he yelled back. Jack backed up a bit, took a deep breath, and launched himself right at the wolf, driving his shoulder into the animal's chest. The wolf tumbled over under the force of Jack's assault, dropping Malevolent to the ground as Jack's momentum sent them both back to the floor. Jack landed hard, but the wolf had barely touched the ground before he was back on his feet and heading for the fairy queen once more. As the wolf stalked his prey, the world began to slow down again for Jack. On the other side of the room, Philip struggled futilely against his chains, his face a mask of enormous pain, yet also stubborn determination. May, meanwhile, had inserted herself between the wolf and the fairy queen, trying to stop the animal's attack. All this Jack took in as the wolf bent down, then leapt straight at the princess. The animal's arc sent him right over May's head, though, and straight for the fairy queen. Until Jack took a step forward, grabbed the wolf's flowing fur cape, and yanked down with all his strength. Though the wolf's head came to a stop, the rest of his body continued moving forward, completely flipping him. The wolf's back slammed into the ground just past May, barely a foot short of Malevolent. This actually seemed to surprise the wolf. He lay on the ground for a fraction of a second, dazed, but even the amount of time was plenty for Jack, given how slowly time seemed to be moving. His mind strangely blank, Jack pulled out his sword and pointed it straight at one of the wolf's glowing red eyes. As he stared down at the wolf, his face expressionless, the sword's normal cloudy white glow changed to a deep, desolate black, as if it were sucking the light out of the very room. And just like that, time returned to its normal speed. The wolf stared at Jack and his midnight black sword for a very brief moment, then actually smiled. "You win," he growled. "You learn quickly, Jack." "That's right, he does," May shouted, though she didn't seem entirely sure what just had happened. Not that Jack understood either. When time had slowed, he almost felt like he had acted completely without thought, as if he weren't the only one making the decisions. How had he moved so fast? And why had the sword changed color? Except, just like that, the sword brightened from black to its usual dull white, like the sun emerging from behind a cloud. "What are you doing?" May hissed, stepping over him. "Do I look like I know?" he whispered back, still staring at the sword. "It doesn't exactly make me feel better." "Look out!" Philip bellowed from across the room. Jack immediately grabbed May and dove to the floor, barely dodging a bolt of lightning that incinerated the stones just above the Wolf King. Jack quickly looked up from the floor to find Malevolent, her hair swirling around her as she stood in the middle of a tornado of wind and lightning. As he watched, the Fairy Queen's lips parted, rising into a wide grin. Except they didn't stop there. Her mouth continued to pull apart as Malevolent's entire face bulged and stretched grotesquely, almost as if there was something inside her, fighting to break free of its prison. "You pathetic little mortals," the Fairy Queen snarled from her much too wide mouth, her voice deeper now. "You have no idea the power you have challenged." As her face continued to grow in places it wasn't meant to, two long black claws abruptly sliced their way straight out of Malevolent's back, twitching and shuddering with wild abandon at their freedom. As her whole body shook, the Fairy Queen's mouth suddenly unhinged, and her lower jaw dropped open far enough to almost curl up under itself. From inside her mouth emerged a black reptilian head. The claws on her back continued thrashing around, growing as they pushed out farther and farther until finally long bat-like wings unfurled, spreading from one corner of the room to the other, ripping apart the rest of the Fairy Queen's body as it did. And there, standing in the remains of what had seemed to be a normal human woman, was a dragon, her black skin shining like a glowing shadow. The terrifying beast whipped her long neck to the left, then to the right, reveling in her freedom from her human-shaped shell. The dragon reared back on her hind legs and lifted her long neck straight up, then came crashing down to the floor, hard enough to shake the foundations of the castle. Her head snapped down a second later, releasing a sickly green flame straight at Jack, May, and the Wolf King. Instead, it hit the mirror. As May and Jack clutched the mirror by the hanging wire on its back, the fire splayed off to either side of them, barely missing them, and the Wolf King right behind them. The dragon roared furiously and doubled the intensity of her flame. The heat of the unnatural fire almost staggered Jack, and May didn't look much better, but neither dropped the mirror. Philip, still chained to the wall, pulled himself as far from the flames as the chains would allow, even on the opposite side of the room. The prince was soaked through with sweat. The whole room's temperature rose past uncomfortable, heading straight toward burning alive. Jack turned to May and nodded, shaking the sweat from his eyes. May nodded back, her entire face glistening in the firelight. They really only had one choice. They both took an uncomfortable breath, then began to slowly push the mirror forward toward the dragon's mouth. The dragon redoubled her efforts, and now the green flame completely filled Jack's vision. But neither he nor May stopped pushing the mirror steadily toward the dragon's mouth. As they inched forward, the flame actually seemed to lessen a bit. Maybe she was running out of breath. And then the fire stopped abruptly as the dragon's head snaked up and over the mirror, her mouth open wide to devour both Jack and May in one bite. Instead, she found herself staring at her reflection in the mirror smashed up against her chin. The dragon let out a bellow of pain, then snarled and shot back down toward the two teenagers, her mouth open wide. The dragon latched her teeth onto the mirror and ripped it from their grasp, realizing too late that she'd been set up. Jack and May had to let go of the mirror. As Malevolent stared down at Jack and May with the mirror in her mouth, both humans smiled up at her, then raised their weapons, Jack with his sword, May with the broomstick from Jack's bag. Malevolent reared back, but she was too late. Jack and May struck in unison, each using two hands to smash their weapons down as hard as they could right on the dragon's head. Malevolent's head smacked down against the floor, and she roared in pain, but Jack didn't wait. There was no time. They needed some way to tie the dragon down, or she'd just fill the entire room with flame, and that would be it. But how could you tie down a dragon with a neck like a snake? And there wouldn't be enough rope in the castle to keep that enormous body still. What could he... And then it came to him. As Malevolent started to raise her head up once more, Jack threw his hands into his grandfather's bag and pulled out the reins they'd used on Samson. Reins that supposedly could tame any horse, no matter how wild. Maybe it would work on something other than a horse. Jack dropped the bag, then leapt up onto the dragon's neck as she raised it. Malevolent began to shake her head wildly from side to side, flames shooting out the spurts. But Jack just hugged her neck as hard as he could and inched his way up toward her head. Maybe she suspected what he was doing, or maybe she just feared what he could do from this position. But Malevolent grew even more desperate, banging her body into the stone walls and ceiling hard enough to make them crumble in places. However, she moved, though. Jack just kept climbing until he reached the back of the dragon's head. From there, he gathered the reins in his hands and waited for his moment. It didn't take long. The dragon immediately roared in frustration, opened her mouth wide. Just before she let loose another torrent of flame, Jack grabbed the ends of the reins in both hands and swung the mouthpiece right into Malevolent's open mouth.